The narcissism of empires. Why every superpower thinks it's special. The marbles shattered the same way in Rome, Constantinople, and Washington, not from external force, but from the weight of its own reflection. Empires don't fall because they're weak. They fall because they believed they couldn't. There's a pattern older than flags or borders, woven through every civilization that called itself exceptional. It moves beneath treaties and speeches, invisible until you learn to see it. The same psychology that makes a person believe they're destined for greatness also makes nations believe they're immune to history. Like most of us, empires begin by solving real problems: hunger, chaos, vulnerability. But somewhere between necessity and dominance, something shifts. The mirror stops showing what is and starts reflecting what we need to see. Every superpower in history has looked at itself and whispered the same word: chosen. The Romans believed their empire was eternal because the gods willed it. The British Empire called its expansion civilization itself. The Soviet Union proclaimed it was the inevitable future. America named itself the last best hope of Earth. Each one certain, each one special, each one repeating a script written long before their borders existed. What if exceptionalism isn't vision, but pathology? The Mongols swept across continents, believing heaven itself had ordained their conquest. Genghis Khan didn't see himself as a warlord, but as the executor of divine will. The Ottoman sultans claimed they were shadow of God on earth. Imperial Japan taught children they descended from gods. Nazi Germany proclaimed a 1,000-year Reich. Different languages, different centuries, identical delusion. Carl Jung once noted that nations have shadows too. The traits they exile from themselves become the very things they obsess over in others. Every empire projects its deepest fears onto its enemies and calls it moral clarity. The pattern is so consistent, it stops being historical accident and starts revealing something fundamental about collective consciousness. Narcissism, in psychological terms, isn't simply vanity. It's a protective structure built around a wound, a desperate architecture designed to prevent the self from seeing its own fragility. When an individual constructs this defense, we call it a disorder. When an entire nation does it, we call it patriotism. But here's where it becomes fascinating. The narcissism of empires follows the exact same developmental stages as personal narcissism. First comes the grandiose fantasy: we are different, special, destined. Then comes the need for constant validation, monuments, parades, the obsessive documentation of greatness. Then the rage, when reality refuses to confirm the fantasy. History repeats, not because we forget, but because we remember selectively. For a moment, imagine the world map stripped of borders, only psychological patterns moving through time like weather systems. You'd see the same storm formation appearing again and again. The center believes it holds universal truth. The periphery exists only to validate or threaten that truth. Everything the empire does is justified by its specialness. Everything done to the empire is proof of the world's moral inferiority. The British didn't colonize, they civilized. The Soviets didn't invade, they liberated. America doesn't occupy, it spreads democracy. The linguistic gymnastics are identical across empires because the underlying psychological need is identical. The empire cannot be wrong because the empire is, by definition, the standard of rightness itself. Was it strategy or collective denial? When Rome began executing Christians, they weren't being cruel, they were protecting civilization from barbarism. When Spain burned heretics, they were saving souls. When Stalin purged millions, he was protecting the revolution. When America dropped atomic fire on cities, it was saving lives through overwhelming force. Each action morally inverted by the narcissistic lens. Each empire unable to see its shadow because shadows don't exist when you are the light. The more a nation preaches its values, the more violently it contradicts them in practice. Not through hypocrisy, but through genuine psychological blindness. The narcissistic empire doesn't see the contradiction because in its cosmology, the contradiction cannot exist. Whatever it does becomes virtuous by virtue of who is doing it. Ancient Athens invented democracy while owning slaves. Victorian Britain abolished slavery while starving Ireland. The Soviet Union promised equality while building gulags. Every empire constructs an identity so brilliant it blinds itself to its own actions. What if conquest was never about territory but about proving the self to the self? The narcissistic pattern reveals itself most clearly in how empires respond to decline. They don't adapt, they double down. Rome kept expanding, even as the center hollowed. The Ottomans insisted on their glory while provinces fell away. The British clung to India, even as the empire became unsustainable. The Soviet Union accelerated its military spending as its economy collapsed, each one choosing fantasy over survival. Because for the narcissistic empire, admitting decline isn't a strategic assessment, it's an existential annihilation. If we're not exceptional, then what was it all for? If we're not chosen, then we're just another nation among nations. If we're not special, then perhaps we're responsible. And responsibility is the one thing the narcissistic structure cannot accommodate. Psychological research shows that when a narcissist's grandiose self-image is threatened, they don't reflect, they attack. Either they rage against the source of the threat, or they collapse into depression and victimhood. Empires follow the same pattern with terrifying precision. As dominance fades, they either lash out violently or retreat into bitter narratives of betrayal and decline. The Spanish Empire blamed others for its fall. The Ottomans created stories of external conspiracy. Post-Soviet Russia developed elaborate theories of Western sabotage, each unable to look inward because the narcissistic wound makes introspection unbearable. Maybe progress was never the goal, only repetition with better technology. There's a particular moment in every empire's arc where it stops learning from others and starts believing it can only teach. The Islamic Golden Age ended when certainty replaced curiosity. Ming China closed its borders when it decided it had nothing left to discover. Victorian Britain lost its innovative edge when it became convinced of inherent superiority. The moment an empire believes it's finished becoming is the moment it begins ending. Narcissism creates a closed loop of self-tease. The only valid information is information that confirms pre-existing specialness. Everything else is filtered out, dismissed, or reinterpreted until it fits the narrative. The empire becomes an echo chamber at continental scale, where truth is whatever reinforces the grandiose ascent. What surprised me most wasn't what I learned about imperial psychology, but how studying these patterns through books like The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert Paxton helped me observe how collective narcissism operates in real time. I wasn't expecting such clarity, and it reminded me that seeing the world differently always starts with seeing ourselves differently. This isn't a recommendation, just something that changed how I process information. I'll leave suggestions below if you want to explore what I mean. But here's the paradox that should make us pause. Every person reading this likely lives in or benefits from a former or current empire. We're not outside observers, we're inside the narcissistic structure, breathing its air, speaking its justifications. Can we see the pattern while being part of it? The psychologist Eric Fromm argued that societies can be sick in ways that feel completely normal to their members. If everyone shares the same delusion, it stops being called delusion and becomes culture. The narcissism of empires isn't an aberration, it's the default setting of concentrated power, meeting human psychology. And yet, empires do eventually face themselves. It usually happens after collapse, when the protective structure finally breaks. Post-war Germany confronted its shadow. Post-apartheid South Africa attempted truth and reconciliation. Post-Soviet states grappled with their history. The pattern suggests that self-awareness for empires, like for individuals, often requires the shattering of the narcissistic defense, which raises an uncomfortable question. Can an empire become self-aware before it falls? For a moment, sit with that uncertainty. Not as political theory, but as psychological reality. Is it possible for collective power to look at itself honestly while it still holds that power? Or does the very structure of dominance require the narcissistic lens to function? History whispers different answers in different moments. Sometimes there are brief windows of collective humility. Sometimes a society pauses and questions itself. These moments rarely last, but they exist, proof that the pattern isn't inevitable, only deeply probable. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote Reflections questioning power while holding absolute power. It didn't save Rome, but it showed the possibility. He demonstrated that even at the center of empire, consciousness can flicker awake and see itself clearly, if only for a moment. The flags still wave, but now we might see them differently. They were never about nations being special. They were about the human mind's need to construct meaning from chaos, to find uniqueness in pattern, to build identity from the wound of insignificance. Every empire that called itself exceptional was partially right. They were exceptional, not in being different from the pattern, but in how perfectly they embodied it. The narcissism wasn't a flaw in their greatness. It was the mechanism of their greatness, and simultaneously, the seed of their unraveling. Somewhere between the monuments and the ruins, we stopped seeing empires as moral actors and started seeing them as psychological case studies. The same drives that make a person believe they're destined for singular importance make nations believe they're destined to reshape the world in their image. It's not evil. It's not even particularly unusual. It's the default behavior of power-meeting psyche. What changes isn't whether empires form or believe themselves special. What changes is whether we recognize the pattern while we're living inside it, whether we can hold both truths simultaneously, that every civilization needs narrative and meaning, and that the narcissistic version of meaning eventually devours what it promised to protect. The marble still shatters the same way it always has. But perhaps, just perhaps, if we understand why, we might catch it before it falls. This is educational interpretation, not political prescription. The pattern exists regardless of ideology. Left and right, east and west, ancient and modern, the narcissism of empires transcends the categories empires create to explain themselves. What part of this made you reconsider how collective identity forms and what it costs us when we stop questioning it? If this made you think differently, you've already joined the shadow. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.